All right, welcome to another edition of Kitchen Conversation. Today I am with the head of USA Pickleball's equipment division. I don't exactly know your title. I know it's a long title. I've seen it before. Carl Schmitz, thank you for joining us. What is your title?
It's Managing Director of Facilities Development and Equipment Standards.
Excellent. That is a long title, and we're not going to
It
talk about
is.
half of it. We're going to talk about the equipment part today because
Okay.
obviously equipment has become a very hot topic in paddles in particular. First of all, how's it going? Good to see you again.
It's going well. Going well. We just had a board and senior staff meeting here in Phoenix to talk about new programming, issues like this, and a number of other things that we're planning for the future. It was a very productive couple of days here, and I'm looking forward to getting back out there. There's a number of projects that I'm working on right now that I'm sure we'll touch on as we go through this that are relative to paddles. I'm traveling to San Diego for training on the 3D uh, the 3D scanner, which we'll be using for surfaces of paddles. And then next week, I'll be going through a hands-on with our new um, bond tester, which we'll be talking about relative to delamination.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll step it back a little bit because you are overseeing the equipment, and obviously with delamination coming out and lots of I won't say issues with paddles, but some new issues I would say have kind of popped up. And let's talk about your background and what makes you the right person, because I was kind of blown away when we met in Austin, saw some of the technology that you brought in to help alleviate these problems, to identify which paddles are within spec and not. What is your background?
Well, there's a lot of water under the bridge by now at this point in my life. I've done a little bit of everything. The last 20 years, I was in tech. I was working for a Fortune 50 technology company, in addition to another smaller public company based in the UK. I spent most of the time abroad, working with large customers like Alcatel and Nokia, among others. Prior to that, I was an entrepreneur for a few years and a recovering entrepreneur after that. And but I learned a lot in terms of business startups, where you have to do a little bit of everything. Prior to that, I was let's see, oh, I was a racquetball pro through my 20s. During the boom years of that sport and also during the tapering of that sport. I was a club GM through part of that. And so, it was very difficult, shutting down courts or converting them to nurseries or weight rooms or aerobic studios when that sport started to taper. I'd moved into that sport because having played tennis through my high school years, um, as I moved into the working world, I was actually a systems engineer with a focus on industrial engineering with Battelle Memorial Institute. So I was a bit of a nerd right out of school, but I was also playing quite a bit of racquetball at the time, and so I was able to get into that. I figured I'd be young only once, and I got into sport at that time, and then ultimately I was managing a couple of clubs in the Northwest.
Nice. All right. So you sound really well versed in kind of the perfect person to be owning this. I'm going to
It's a
say yes. I'm going to say,
convergence. It's a convergence of just about everything I've done through my life.
yeah, it's pretty good. So I think they're lucky to have found you, and I feel like you're the right guy to be at the helm.
Thank
So
you.
let's talk about delamination. That seems to be the hottest topic. Last year at the US Open, we had the first Paddlegate, which was about grittiness. And that's a very superficial problem, right? And yes, some paddle manufacturers might have been over spec, and that was a relatively easy issue to deal with because it was on the surface, literally on the surface. Delamination is a little bit more problematic because it's about the inside, the inner workings of the paddle.
Mhm,
Can you just if you can break it down? What is delamination? What causes it? And how are we going to deal with this?
mhm. Well, when you look at a paddle, it consists of several different components, but when it's assembled, it is essentially a beam. The facial plies, the core, the opposite facial plies, they all form a fairly rigid member, in which we'll talk a little bit about additional testing that we've looked at when the first open throw paddles came out to test for that rigidity. But the face of the paddle needs to be rigid as well. But we look at it as a single unit, if you would.
Mhm.
We'll talk a little bit about foam cores and things here in a few minutes as well. But the net of it is these paddles, they do the issue with them is that they can become debonded. Um, they start off as a beam, but once that bond breaks down between the facial plies and the core, a lot of things can happen. In the past, with these paddles that did not have an encircling frame, the we'll talk about thermoforming here in a minute. But these in the past, these paddles would just get soft and they'd be unplayable because those facial plies would not be suspended and it would just become quite mushy and almost unplayable. With
Yeah,
this
and so let me
new
just let me just insert myself. So when you talk about that, the old way was a sandwich construction, two pieces of a face that went around a core, and it was bonded with an adhesive. So glue basically
right,
keeping
hmm
them together. And if it
hmm
came apart, then you'd have this kind of flappiness, and it would just kind of deaden the
mushy,
ball, and it mushy, right?
correct.
And it didn't
That's
help.
right. Right. But this new generation of paddles, there's about five manufacturers that are using this configuration. There's essentially a hard carbon tube frame around the paddle that those facial plies are bonded to, and they're also bonded to the core as well. It plays normally out of the box, but we're still researching what the failure mode could be. Is it the adhesive? Is it the forming technology? Is it temperature related? There's a number of things that we're evaluating, to determine this. But the net of it is, um, if that separates from the core, it's still suspended by that rigid frame. And so
Mhm.
there can be quite a bit of tension in that, and it'll store and return energy when that delamination occurs.
Okay, so this is so thermoforming has essentially tension in the build, right? And
When it's got this frame, thermoforming's been around quite some time. It's not new,
okay,
but
okay,
it's
so
when
it's attached to a frame, so it's having
yeah,
thermoform to the frame creates the tension, and then if it
yes.
debonds, it becomes like a trampoline effect.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so it's the combination of thermoforming and the edge kind of using attaching it to the edge essentially, and that's what's creating the tension. So
Mhm.
this is being produced within spec, right? There is nothing
Oh
going on
yeah.
fishy
Yeah.
here.
No, not at all. I mean, the paddles are produced to spec. They go through a very rigorous testing function. Once they're signed off on, they go to market with them. Now, understanding what that failure mode is, we heard that in many cases these paddles were delaminating in cold weather. And
Mhm.
so it was perhaps the bonding agent, the glue, that was getting brittle and letting go. In other cases, the concern is perhaps the overall tension across the paddle that's created. There's an equivalency that I like to look at when looking at the older generation paddles with the facial ply core and a facial ply. They're almost like an ice cream sandwich,
Mhm.
but there's nothing on the sides of them. If you're familiar with the Magnum bar or something like that, where it's fully dipped, it's rigid around the outside. So the inside of it could be completely gone, but it would still be a rigid frame around it. And so this newer generation of paddles with that external frame around it, if you've cut one open, you'll know what I'm talking about. They essentially suspend the facial plies, and if that core delaminates or breaks down, then you've got a fairly active surface of the paddle, at least for a short period of time. But this is only after it's been in market, and we're still trying to understand what the failure mode is of those. But most of the
Right.
manufacturers are leaning in. They've come out with updates to their manufacturing processes, and they're very well aware that this needs to be taken taken care of very quickly. They're certainly not doing it intentionally, and any performance impact that might be seen in this situation is short-lived. They don't perform, with an increase in power for very long. It might be a spike, and then it quickly deteriorates.
Right. Um, yeah. So is there any thought to alleviating this issue by changing the regulations on thermoforming, or by having these edge kind of attached at the edge? Is there any thought to that, or is it all about using better adhesives that can go through climate change and the hitting of a ball
Yeah.
repeatedly?
I think it's just improvements in manufacturing process. I've been in contact with several of the manufacturers. They're working on this. There's no benefit to them if this delamination occurs. Again, a player might see a spike in power off the face of the paddle, but it's for a very short period of time. It's very difficult to control. So really, there's not a great benefit to them for this. And of course, the degradation curve is fairly fast, and they end up with a paddle that's pretty much unusable. The players that I've spoken with that have experienced this at the pro events that I've been supporting, in almost every case, they'll throw it in their bag right away because once you lose control, it's very difficult to stay in the game, and so that's not a feature that they're really looking for.
Right. Okay. So we have a problem that you can't see with the human eye. How do we test this? And it's also degradation. This is happening post purchase, wear and tear, and all of a sudden you now have a different functioning paddle. How does USA Pickleball, how does the PPA, MLP, APP, how are they going to manage this and understand if something is not within spec anymore?
Sure. And so it was a couple of tournaments back. We acquired a demo unit of an ultrasonic bond tester. And so what this does, it's got a pitch and a catch probe. It drives an ultrasonic signal into the feature that you're trying to measure, and it will determine whether or not the delamination has occurred. And so we're actually acquiring one of these devices, and we'll have it. Let's see, we'll have it next weekend at the PPA event in Newport, and then I'll have it with me at a following event, an APP event. I believe it's in Sacramento the week following. So we're on it. We want to make sure that we are using the right technology to identify the failure mode, the issue, and also we're talking to the manufacturers about what they're doing to ensure that this doesn't continue to happen.
And how does that process take place at a tournament? I'm not sure if you guys have the rules in place yet, but are players have to kind of submit their paddles before they play, or is it upon a challenge that it will be tested after?
Yeah, what we put in place is essentially an equivalent to what they do in table tennis, and it's called racket control, in our case, paddle control. The players will submit a number of paddles to be tested prior to competition. Um, what we've done in the past, it's been voluntary up until the quarterfinals, and then they're retested going into the finals themselves. There's a non-removable sticker that's assigned to that paddle. It's tracked. The actual specs for roughness are captured as well. And then once we introduce this bond testing for delamination, we'll also be recording the results of that. And so I think the process that we're developing, we launched it at Nationals last November, and then we made it available to each of the tours here in the first quarter. We had a couple of events with the PPA. We'll have an event with the APP here shortly as well. So, and then we were on site for the MLP event in Daytona just a few weeks back.
Got it. And so, in the past, I think players were a little bit worried that perhaps people were doing this on purpose, that they were trying to get a trampoline effect. Obviously, that window is pretty narrow, and it might not be to their benefit because it starts going a little bit haywire after a few whacks of the ball. Is there rules in? Are there rules in place that prohibit you from tampering with the paddle to be manipulated to give you that trampoline effect. I know
There's
there's, I know, I was going to say, I know that there is a dwell time test that you guys can perform, but to try to manipulate something, is that against the rules, or is that just a void that we don't have to protect against?
Well, there's a rule 2E2 that does state if the paddle delaminates, then the player must retire that piece of equipment. And so it doesn't define whether it was intentionally tampered or it was just a natural degradation of the equipment. We think that it covers both essentially, but it is incumbent on the player to retire that paddle.
Okay, so once they recognize that something's going on with their paddle, if they feel it, that's when they should change paddle.
Yeah.
Are they, are they meant to put their hand up and say, "Hey, I think something's going on. I want to change out my paddle"?
Yeah, I mean it's been consistent. What I've seen in the PPA events that I've covered here over the last 2 months or so, the players do not want to play with these because of the lack of control. You may get a little bit of extra heat on the ball for a short period of time, but the control is very poor in terms of keeping it in the court, and so they'll typically retire them. So a couple of the players that I spoke with that did experience this at a few of the events this last season, the last couple of months, they immediately parked the paddle right away. And so I don't think there's an intentional, a situation where someone's walking out on the court with the paddle they know has started to delaminate because the loss of control, the curve in terms of how fast that power ends up being lost really impacts their performance. So we haven't really seen anything nefarious going on out there, but I do believe it's important that we put in place some testing just to ensure that everyone feels it's a level playing field out there.
And do we have any idea how widespread this is? I mean, is this something that's happening? Is this rare or is this commonplace? Do we have any idea?
Well, it's not 100%, across the paddles that are using this configuration of the thermoforming and this encircling frame. Um, I've hit with some myself, and they're definitely a lively paddle out of the box. I like how they hit, frankly, um, but I think the occasion is probably a combination of things. Lower temperatures, what we saw in the first quarter this year, I think may have been a trigger that caused that debonding. So two things I believe have taken place across all of those manufacturers creating those paddles that are using that configuration is that they've revisited the bonding agents that they use in the paddle face. They're also evaluating how the there's a pressure involved in this thermoforming process, and with that rigid frame, it may keep the face of the paddle from truly meeting under pressure, meeting the core and bonding thoroughly. So they're reevaluating the dyes that they're using for
Hmm.
this the forming or thermal forming, and they're also looking at the bonding agents that they're using, the overall thermal profiles, for the forming as well. So I think they're all over it. It's not a good look for them if there's a lot of paddles being retired. It costs a lot of money if they're coming back, and if a player feels like sure there may be a spike in power or heat off the face of the paddle, it's short-lived, and the loss of control, of course. The sport's all about being able to control the ball, and so they may be able to hit it very hard for a short period of time, but the long-term impact is that they'll need to retire the paddle pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think this is the pro level we're talking about, where players can control a very hot paddle, and it does give them an advantage, and there's money at stake, and so there are kind of different reasons why someone might want that or use that. At the rec level, there's no reason for anyone to really want this other than a mild flex. Uh, but it's actually dangerous. I mean, especially in the hands of non-professionals, the ball's coming off really hot, and that's not good for the game at the rec level. I feel like this game is about touch, it's about rallies, it's about strategy, and all those things go together. When you start having a paddle that hits the ball that hard, I feel like a lot of that is removed and it becomes a different game. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, I like to see, the game played with its full breadth of everything from, the softest dinks to a shootout, where you're 14 feet from each other, and there's some pretty blistering speeds, that you'll see. When those speeds exceed reaction times, or they're unexpectedly fast, based on traditional play or the norm. Certainly, safety, if safety is truly an issue here, then those paddles definitely should be retired right away. But again, that's written into the rules, 2E2, a delaminated paddle needs to be retired.
And so, how do you measure, or is there a number when you talk about speeds, being outspeeding reaction time, essentially? How does that get measured? Is there a number of how fast the ball should be coming off of a paddle?
We don't have a metric for that yet. We do measure deflection, but
Mhm.
that's really not much of a dynamic test. It's almost static. It's a very slow application of pressure on the paddle face. Um, there is there may be the potential to look at something like this in the future. Ben Johns just penned an article where he's talking about coefficient of restitution. And so that's something that we really need to think about. How do we measure this in the future? There's a way of doing it. Um, the one thing I've noticed, though, that there's a couple of terms being thrown around out there. One is delamination, another is deflection, another is dwell time, and then of course we're talking coefficient of restitution now. They're all closely related, but they're not interchangeable. And so it's important to understand what those things are. Dwell is the amount of time that a ball spends on the face of the paddle. Um, Delamination, we've been talking about quite a bit. Deflection can be, a very slow process. Um, and again, we do measure that using an Instron tester. And then, of course, coefficient of restitution is really what we're talking about. And so, when you look at these other uh, features or defects, as we're talking, looking at delamination, for example. Um, how fast is the ball returned off of the face of the paddle? And so, coefficient of restitution really is one of the things that we need to be looking at in terms of how to measure. This is done in other sports, but it is a ballistic test, and so we need to introduce a new type of testing approach to be able to capture that data.
So, coefficient of restitution is essentially the speed going in and coming out. Is that
That's right.
essentially
Yeah,
it?
it's a
Okay.
ratio. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
Obviously, I knew that. I was just for the people out there. I just wanted to make sure
of
that
course.
everyone
Yeah.
understood. Right. Coefficient of restitution. Thanks, Ben.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that being said, now that we know that speed does matter and it does affect the way this game is played, and obviously injuries can occur if things are out of spec. Um, we now have manufacturers producing paddles that go outside of spec, and they're under the banner of concept paddles, and they're using EVA foam. What is EVA foam?
Well, there's a number of different foams that can be used in paddles. It's not. I wouldn't categorize all foams as being good or bad. I think you might be talking about the Vice, for example. This concept paddle, I in fact played with it for the first time here this week during our board offsite, and there's the material itself isn't what we're concerned about. It's the rigidity of the paddle. And so from our perspective, the paddle is a solid beam. It shouldn't be too flexible. The face shouldn't be too flexible. The combination of materials are what we're concerned with. And there are paddles out there today that actually use EVA foam already. But the combination of facial plies, the form overall that's used to enclose that foam core, it still results in a rigid member, which is fine. We're becoming we're less and less concerned with the materials used as we are the specifications and the performance of the product itself. And so they exist already. Many paddles out there that have passed deflection and the other tests that we perform that use EVA foam. So it's not a barred substance by any stretch because it's been used for quite some time.
Right. Okay, but that would make it easier to understand as the consumer that, hey, this is an illegal substance or this is not. Because we don't have that, it's a little bit more nuanced of a conversation. I think that ultimately what we're looking for is the seal of approval, right? The USA approved paddle. That means that it
Hmm.
fits to standard, it fits to spec. The coefficient of restitution is within its means, and it's not going to come off too hot. If it doesn't have that mark, we don't know if it's below or above, or is it even considered a pickleball paddle? Like, what are the rules? I made a post the other day about this, and I thought it was irresponsible, quite honestly. I love innovation, and I want to see us move this game forward. But when you go outside of the spec and you start making things that can go faster than they're meant to be, faster than people's reaction times, uh, all of a sudden, if I bring a tennis racket out to a pickleball game, can I use that? Who's to tell me
Well, it's
I'm
no, it's
allowed or
it's
not
no
allowed?
longer it's no longer pickleball to begin with. But yeah, it's a great question. The specifications are in place for a number of reasons. One is to ensure a level playing field that we're all using equipment that performs in a similar way. But to your point, we the sport's genesis was really it was a game of finesse. Working the ball around the kitchen, and then over time when more and more athletic people started to move into the sport, or those with rackets backgrounds, the sport did speed up quite a bit. We've seen new materials come in as well here over the last 3 or 4 years, which are starting to increase the ability to spin the ball. Um, there's a little bit more heat, coming off the paddles as well. I would also, though, look at the stature of the athletes moving into the sport as well. When you look at the wave of former tennis players that are moving into sport that have the stroke mechanics to develop a lot of speed, it's not all the paddle. There's some very solid athletes moving into the sport as well. But to your point, um, yeah, I think there's a limit. We put in place these specifications for a number of reasons, and one of them is safety. I think it's very important to understand that the paddle is meant to be a fairly rigid member, right? Not to return a lot of power. Most of the paddles today, or an increasing number of paddles today, use what some call a raw carbon face, right? That actually absorbs energy, and so it's very useful for finesse, for touch,
Mhm.
and of course with the rougher surfaces, they're still within spec, a spec that's been around for years. Players are able to put a substantial amount of spin on the ball. Of course, spin allows players to hit the ball a bit harder but still keep it in the court. With
Mhm.
topspin, for example. So we're seeing that there's a number of dynamics to this. You can't really put a finger on, it's just one thing. You have to look at the overall performance envelope of a paddle, the contributing factors, how rigid is the paddle, how heavy is it as well, and then how lively is the surface. To your point, the paddle's meant to be fairly rigid, which
Yep.
means it's not going to return a lot of power. The coefficient of restitution shouldn't be so great that it's almost a string bit, for example.
Yeah. Well, so at the beginning of this, you said that if I brought a tennis racket out to a pickleball game, it's no longer pickleball. But just because a paddle looks like a paddle, what actually makes it a paddle? I mean, is it the USA approved? Is that officially a paddle? If it does not have that, or if it goes above that spec, is it? I mean, it just feels like there's no hard fast rules of what I'm supposed to be playing with or what I should be allowed to play with. If someone shows up to my rec game with a vice paddle, you know, I feel like they
Well,
have
well,
an
sir,
unfair advantage.
sure. Certainly, outside of rec, if we're talking about competition,
Mhm.
the standard is a USA Pickleball approved paddle. It's gone through tests. There's an understanding that no one really has a severe advantage in terms of roughness, in terms of deflection. Those things are very important. We've got the lab at NTS. It's an independent lab. They go through the tests there, and only after they pass those tests and also visual inspection through the Equipment Evaluation Committee does a paddle actually receive certification. What happens out in the rec market, um, the accepted position is that we're all using something that's been tested and falls within a certain performance envelope. There are manufacturers though that do not submit paddles for testing. And so, there's a number of manufacturers that you can find in big box stores, for example, that we'll never see. You see these on Amazon as well,
Mhm.
and they have no intent of ever, these paddles really going out into a controlled competitive environment. They're basically a high volume paddle that they want to reach a large market with. Um, those are out of our control. We can't actually demand that they submit them for testing. So if somebody picks up one of these and walks out into the rec court, to play, um, I would ask the question, what is that you're using? How do you know that it's safe to use? So some of these paddles that are coming out, the Vice is a pretty hot paddle. I hit with it, and you can generate some pretty significant heat with this paddle. Um, and they've not submitted it for testing for a number of reasons. It's got holes in the face of the paddle, which takes it out of any type of certification to begin with. It's got a fairly flexible face, and I don't think it would probably pass deflection, but they're not intending for this paddle to be used in the field of competition. Um, I'm not sure I've answered your question there, but there's I think an agreement, in the playing community that what you play with, will be a tested and fair piece of equipment, and you won't have an unfair advantage with that. Um, Beyond, making a statement like that and putting in place the testing processes that we do, there's only so much that we can do, to
Sure.
ensure that someone doesn't walk out with some super paddle that is very different than the one that's generally available on the market and that
Yeah,
has
and
gone
I
through
understand that
approvals.
not everybody's going to apply for USA approval and not USA pickleball approval, which is fine because some of these will fit well within spec. They just don't want to go through that process, or whether it's time, money, whatever it might be. That's okay as long as they're not souping it up, as far as I'm concerned. But there's also no way to tell. I feel like maybe there's another kind of certification that could be, listen, this is using all the materials that are proper to use in a proper way. We haven't tested it, but we believe it to be safe. And then there's this other version that is concept paddles using materials together that we know not that are not within spec. They go above, and they are deemed not safe according to USA Pickleball. Because I feel like it's going to be dangerous. EVA foam is quiet, right? When people take a big swing at something, you don't have the audible, clue to know that that ball is going to come a little hotter than you expect it. So you have, less sound, higher velocity. That's a recipe for injury.
It's a That's a very good point. Um, we are introducing a secondary certification. There are HOAs and some public courts where they're very closely located to residential areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so the proposal is that we'll create a category of recreation paddle
Mm-hmm.
that is quieter. It might be closer to 80 decibels, where the majority of paddles are up around 85. And that's something, we'll create a threshold of paddles that we consider quieter. They're less than 85 decibels, and they're no higher than 1,000 hertz, given some lab tests that we put together. This new category of paddle, it'll be for recreation use only, and there will be some relaxation in the standards. They can use some different materials. The face might be a bit softer. Example I have here is a Q1 by Master.
I played against that paddle. That's not pickleball.
It's sticky. It's a little
I mean,
sticky, and we've not put in. we've not put in place what those specific standards will be for this new category. This just represents an
Yeah.
example of a paddle that is being produced for to try to approach that market.
Right. And I played against somebody who was using that paddle who I looked at it after they hit forehands that were ripped and topspin that just dove
Mm,
like I've never seen
mhm.
before. And I realized
Yeah.
this wasn't pickleball. This was a different game. I mean,
Mhm.
I was on a pickleball court, but it was not
Yeah.
like I was playing pickleball. And I asked him to see the paddle. I'd never seen it before. I looked for the USA sticker, nothing there. And I told him that I go, I don't think this is a legal paddle. He's like, yeah, no, it's a quiet paddle and it's allowed. And I thought
Uh,
this is
it,
a tough precedent because I everybody wants it to be quieter. I totally get that.
mhm,
But the
mhm.
rubberized texture of that paddle in particular
Yeah, that's a
is
good point. So yeah, if it fails, for example, the coefficient of friction test,
mhm,
so there'll still be tests that will address safety,
mhm,
right? And so, and we don't want too much deflection. We don't want it to be too sticky because of the things that you can do with the ball with an over sticky surface like that. So it's just an example of a product that's been developed for this niche where a quieter paddle is needed. This, in fact, they used a softer material for the face of it, and it is, it may be a bit soft and sticky for some environments. So we still have yet to land on what those numbers will be for this, this category of paddle, but there is a market for it. Several of the manufacturers are very interested in developing paddles for the sector, and of course on the ball side as well, developing a quiet ball for communities that is an issue. I think is an important development.
yeah, the ball seems like the easiest way to go about it, right? Like there's
It's
only
a
so many.
universal, yeah, it's a common denominator, right?
It's common denominator, right? We're both using the same ball. I could use my,
Mm,
my paddle. I like my paddle, I like your paddle, but the ball is the thing that we both play with, and I feel
mm,
like that's an easier way. And you could almost, there's a foam like ball out there that does not create noise, but it's
mm,
still in the vicinity of pickleball, right? It might not be
mhm.
exactly the same thing, but
Yeah.
it feels pretty much like it, and it's going to
Well,
be absolutely no sound.
there's some very sharp engineers out there that are exploring different polymers that may have a different acoustic profile, which would result in a quieter ball.
That would be great.
Now,
I think
the
it would
big
work.
question though, the big question, Jason, is how quiet is too quiet? And so, to your point,
Yeah.
um, the ball coming off a paddle-like device, or some of these other ones might seem like it's coming off faster, but it could possibly be because you didn't have the corresponding sound of the ball coming off a paddle that you're used to. So your reactions may be a little bit slower. So I think there's a threshold where we all want to be careful about it becoming too quiet because we need those auditory cues. It's
Yep.
almost like playing a yellow ball off a yellow paddle. You need contrast, and so from a visual standpoint, when it comes to audible cues, we need to hear a click or a pop or something coming off the paddle, and there may be a frequency that it's maybe a little too low, and it isn't a trigger. Uh, the trigger that we need to be able to react and
Right.
respond.
It's like electric vehicles, right? They make no sound, so they artificially have sounds.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's a safety issue.
yeah.
And I would also say, like, I think that if you go to a softer ball, essentially, right? Because a wiffle ball, people laugh and they make jokes or in jest. It's a wiffle ball. How it's not really going to hurt you, but it is a hard piece of plastic, and when it comes, flying at your head at 40, 50, 60 miles per hour, it can cause some damage, and it there are eye injuries out there. So I think that from a manufacturing standpoint, making a paddle that goes beyond spec and not putting a warning label on it, I feel like that's negligent in a way. And I'm not a lawyer. I've talked to a few lawyers about this.
Mhm.
It feels like they're in pretty murky territory. I know you're
Well, I
not a
think,
lawyer. One of
yeah,
the few things you're not is a lawyer, so I'm not going to
no,
ask you to make
no,
judgment on it.
dealt with a lot in my time in the tech industry, but so I think you're right. I think there's a lower threshold we have to be careful about. We need auditory cues to react and respond, and so complete stealth, completely quiet game. I don't think we really want to go there. If you've hit a foam ball, some of the very quiet balls out there just that are um, used for super sensitive areas, it is a very different game. It feels very different, and I think there's something to be said for perhaps a lower threshold of 500 hertz, for example. I don't know what the number is, and something to keep in mind. If you've dealt with, I know we're not talking about venues and facilities. I do, and having to um, react or respond to complaints from neighbors around facilities about the noise. The typical situation there is there's probably one or just a couple of complainants in a neighborhood that may surround a pickleball venue. The reason for that is while we're measuring acoustics, we've got a pretty heavy program going on to motivate manufacturers to make quieter paddles. Um, but there's that's a physical science. There's a ancillary science. It's called psychoacoustics, and it's how people uh, how they process sound. And what we find is that there's a small percentage of the population that 1100 hertz that a lot of the paddles hit at is jarring to them. It's a real thing. And so it's important that we look at, how do we make the paddles a little bit quieter? But there's, I think, a lower threshold to where we still need that audible trigger, something that gets us to react and respond. And so I think it's somewhere, I think, south of 1000 hertz is good, but probably north of, 400 or 500 is needed for us to be able to respond and react correctly.
Right. Well, it sounds like you have your hands full. You have a lot of things going on, and it's quite interesting, really. The auditory stuff is quite fascinating, and I feel like it's going to help grow the game because if there's any issues with the game, it's probably the noise. And if we can deal with that or find a solution, then I think that we're well on our way. Now I just don't want to make sure that people don't get hurt out there.
Yeah, no, I agree. So a combination of the delamination and sound, we've got a very close eye on both. I think there's an interest in protecting the integrity of the game. We don't want to change it too much, but there's some things that we can do to help address issues like acoustics and in this case, the configuration of the paddle that we were talking about before. We'll pay attention to it, make sure we put the tests in place to handle that. One point I wanted to make on the facility side and the noise around the facilities, it's a fairly small percentage where this is happening. And what we're doing is putting in place a support group. We're working with Pickleball Sound Mitigation, run by Bob Unitic. He's helped us create some acoustic tests, which we'll be testing every paddle, and we'll be able to categorize them in a certain way. Um, and then this other development program that I talked about, the quieter paddles for rec, I think that'll be significant in terms of helping open up facilities that may have been shut because of this problem.
Yeah. Well, Carl, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it. I think I'm glad that we got the chance to talk, and I'm glad that everyone gets to hear that the sport is in really good hands. Smart people working on complicated problems, but I have a lot of confidence that you and amongst the others are the right people to find the solutions. So, thanks for
Well,
what you're doing.
you bet. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this. It's an important topic. Um, it's a bit nerdy, but it's something that we do need to pay attention to. Both the delamination, those issues, but also the acoustics. Those are very important things that we need to spend the time and understand what the solutions are around.
Absolutely. All right, Carl,
Okay,
thank you so much. Appreciate it.
you bet,
See you
Jason.
later.